Hello and welcome to a Firstpost POV. It's been called the most dangerous and challenging moment for the Iranian regime since the revolution in 1979. Thousands, tens of thousands of people, in fact, have hit the streets of Iran over what started as protests against the economic condition and have now evolved into calls for a regime change. In response, Tehran and the government has responded by imposing a complete internet blackout since the 8th of January, and they're cracking down heavily on these protesters. Some reports say the death toll has reached thousands of people. The question is, how will this unrest and these protests unfold over the next coming days, and what more will the regime do to try and quell this unrest? Joining me now to discuss the situation in Iran and how it will possibly unfold is Dr. Ali Vaez, who's the director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for speaking to us on Firstpost.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, just before we started this recording, I saw that the Iranian International had a report out saying that possibly 12,000 people were killed in the crackdown by the Iranian regime. Now, 12,000 is a massive number that goes beyond just a crackdown. It amounts to mass slaughter. I'm wondering if you have any details about whether that death toll could be accurate considering the scale of the crackdown.
Well, that outlet is not known for accurate reporting, but there is no doubt that the Iranian regime brought down the iron fist in a terrible way this time around. And the death toll is definitely in the thousands, but I don't think we know at this stage the exact number and the extent of the bloodbath that the Iranian regime committed.
Right. Now, a lot of focus right now is on what the US President Donald Trump would do. He has said that all options, including a military attack on regime power centers, are on the table right now. Do you expect the US President to go ahead with this operation, or do you think this is more about leverage, creating threat and intimidating the regime to bring it to the table?
So look, first of all, it might already be a bit too late, and the president might be enforcing that red line retroactively, because it does appear that the protests in Iran, at least this round, is coming to an end under the brute force that the regime has deployed. So I'm not sure taking military action at this stage would really do anything to help the Iranian protesters. But the reality is that the options in front of the United States are not attractive. Kinetic options like killing the supreme leader or political decapitation, in the way that Israel tried but didn't achieve during the June 2025 war with Iran, or even attacking the repressive apparatus, might either create a political vacuum that would be filled with even more hardline, less pragmatic and more ideological elements, including the Revolutionary Guards, or might result in violent chaos, which would not necessarily help the protesters. And non-kinetic options, like cyber attacks or doubling down on enforcement of existing sanctions, I don't think would move the needle that much, because the Iranian regime has already been subject to most of these kind of covert operations, and it has not loosened its grip on repression.
Right. You mentioned that the protests are coming to an end, and that's an interesting point you make. Who formed the crux of these people that we saw on the streets of Iran? Were they loyalists of the Shah? Were they genuine, ordinary people who were raising their voice against the poor economic condition in the country? Who made up the chunk of the protesters, the tens of thousands of people that we saw over the last few weeks?
Look, the reason these protests were seen as different was because they really cut across social class, gender, geography. It really brought almost the entire population together. You had men and women marching on the streets, young and old, pious and secular. And the reason is there was a sense of desperation, really, that the country is facing a polycrisis of environmental, economic, social, political, regional, military crisis, given the recent confrontation with the US and Israel. And so there was a sense of being at a dead end with the current trajectory. And this is what brought the population together. Now, in terms of what the Iranian people want, it is very clear that they want to see the back of the Islamic Republic. In terms of what they want to replace it with, I think there are still a variety of views. Some people want the restoration of the monarchy. Some people want a secular republican system. It is really not clear what they want. And this is one of the reasons that I think that the protests have difficulty in terms of staying power, because there is no individual or leader who can organize and mobilize the masses in the long period of time in a sustained fashion.
Would it be fair to say then that at least this round of unrest or protests seem to be over, that the regime has survived somehow, or is there a possibility of another flare-up down the line, maybe a few days from now?
Look, one thing is clear: the Islamic Republic is good at suppressing protests, but it's absolutely not good at addressing the underlying causes of them. And so, inevitably, these grievances will explode again, and the streets will witness additional turmoil in the coming days, weeks, or months. Nobody knows exactly when. But the reality is that in Iran, you see that the pace of protests are becoming more frequent, they're becoming more violent, and it's because the regime is not able to resolve the country's long-standing economic, political, social, environmental problems. And so, even if this round is lost to the protesters, even if this battle is lost to them, they have not lost the war, and I'm sure that these protests will erupt again.
Now, the worrying factor here seems to be that the brutal strategies that the regime uses seem to work every time. In the sense, every time people hit the streets, there are massive protests. The regime unleashes a brutal crackdown, kills hundreds and thousands of people, and then the protests end. So every time the regime then has the incentive to employ the same strategy once again. So then what happens down the line if the regime is to be changed? Is it inevitable that a foreign intervention is necessary? Or do you see the protests perhaps building up to a scale or a core at one point that the crackdown simply won't work? How will a positive regime change happen?
Look, what is likely to happen is regime transformation, and part of that is just inevitable. The supreme leader is 86. He is responsible for a lot of the failures of the system. He's responsible for the fact that Iran finds itself in a corner right now, especially in terms of its insistence on animosity towards Israel, on not budging on some of the red lines that Iran has in the nuclear negotiations, or continued support for partners and proxies in the region. And so once he's not there, there might be an opportunity for some kind of either a top-down or a bottom-up change to the system. It's inevitable. We don't know when it will happen and how it would happen and what comes next, but that is definitely one pivotal point that is just around the corner. But otherwise, again, as I said, I think what we are likely to see is almost continuous protests, sometimes at lower levels, sometimes at much more violent and nationwide levels, because as long as the regime is not delivering on some of the fundamental demands of its own population, it is only buying time until the next confrontation between the state and the society.
Are there any indications that there was perhaps a fracture in the top leadership or within the security establishment of Iran during these protests? Or were they largely unified behind the Ayatollah this time around?
There were no cracks at the top, and this is one of the reasons that repression still works for the regime. It's this belief that they're all sitting in the same boat, and if it sinks, they all sink together. There is no viable alternative or an exit strategy for the political elite. And this is one of the reasons that they resort to using lethal force every time. Now, you have, of course, an imbalance between a state armed to the teeth and a society that is lacks organization, lacks leadership, lacks an end game. And this results in this continuous round of protests that do not succeed. But every time the regime is weakened, it's more isolated, and the population is angrier and more frustrated and fed up with the system. So there is no doubt that the status quo is not sustainable. But again, what comes next depends on not just what the Iranian people want, but also what President Trump and Israel decide to do in the coming days and weeks.
Do you expect the regime to go on perhaps a large-scale persecution hunt to jail perhaps some of the people who led or organized these protests? Or which way do you see the regime going to basically consolidate their power now that this round of protest or unrest is over? What's their strategy looking like?
Well, you should remember that the current leadership in Iran are the revolutionary Jacobins of the 1979. And so they remember how the Shah's regime decided to do reforms in the midst of turmoil. And that basically signaled weakness to the protesters and resulted in them toppling the regime. So this regime is certainly not gonna make any concessions to the population as long as it believes that it's under pressure, internally or externally. That basically means that this situation is likely to continue and to get worse. The economic conditions in Iran, in the absence of sanctions relief or major structural reforms, are likely to continue and only get worse. And there is, of course, the unresolved nuclear standoff between Iran and the West, and there is Israel's concerns about Iran quickly rearming itself. So we are in a situation that Iran would have to fight on two fronts, one against its own people and one against Israel and the United States, which are much more superior conventional and unconventional military powers.
I will come to the United States and Israel, but before that, a question about Mr. Reza Pahlavi, who's the son of the ousted, the last Shah of Iran, who's been in the news. He said that if the protests continue, I would like to return to my country and take over the reins when the regime is toppled. Clearly, that doesn't seem to be happening. But how powerful and influential is the monarchy still in the minds of the Iranian people? A lot of the Western media coverage does seem to suggest that there's sizable loyalty for the monarchy, but there are counter-protesters as well on the street. So how big a player is the Shah? And if there is to be a regime transformation or a change, what sort of a role would he play?
Well, that's a very good question. Look, the reality is that the former crown prince's stock, I think, has improved over the past few months. There's no doubt about it. But the extent of support for him inside the country is unclear. It might be at 10%, it might be at 30%, it might be at 60%. I don't think anybody has a clear sense. But one thing is clear, he is not yet seen as universally as the leader of the opposition. And one thing that he lacks compared to Ayatollah Khamenei in 1979 revolution, he was leading it from exile, as the crown prince wants to do with this new revolutionary movement. But Ayatollah Khomeini had an organization on the ground, a network on the ground that were doing his bidding and were preparing basically the logistical work of a revolutionary movement. The Crown Prince doesn't have that. And so that is, I think, a major impediment. And he hasn't also acted as a unifier, trying to reach out to opposition groups within Iran and try to create a broad umbrella for the opposition movement. And so there are serious questions about his viability as a potential alternative to the Islamic Republic.
Right. Now let's talk about the role of Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very clear that he would like to see the Islamic regime toppled. He talks about so-called friendship between Iran and Israel once a new regime takes over. But we saw last June that the United States never blessed the military operation that Israel carried out. They were forced to join in later on to effectively put an end to it. Do you think that's a possibility if protests rise up once again, that Israel decides there's no point waiting for the Americans joining in to start this operation, let's just start bombing Iran ourselves? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, look, there's always the risk of Israel getting back into military confrontation with Iran because the job was not done in the June war. Iran still has a pathway to a nuclear weapon. There is still half a ton of highly enriched uranium stockpile that is unaccounted for in Iran. There is the fact that Iran is quickly rearming and restocking its ballistic missile arsenal. There is also the fact that Iran is rearming some of the non-state militias that are aligned with it in the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. And the regime is still standing. So from Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective, the job is not done. And he certainly wanted the US to bomb Iran, not just for 45 minutes, but maybe for 45 days. We are in a situation that it was almost inevitable that there will be another round of confrontation between Iran and Israel in 2026. But everybody thought that Israel would not be ready for it in at least the first quarter of this year, because this is a race of missiles against interceptors. And Iran was quickly rearming itself because it's self-sufficient, but Israel is dependent on the United States in order to restock its TOD interceptors, which were the most effective tools of shooting down Iranian hypersonic missiles. So it does appear that Israel would prefer, at this stage, for the United States to take the lead if there is another round of confrontation with Iran. The problem is that if the US attacks Iran, Iran is likely to also retaliate against Israel. And so this could quickly turn from a surgical strike into a region-wide conflagration.
Right. I know the tensions are pretty high right now, but is there a window for diplomacy out of all of this chaos? We heard President Trump say that the Iranians reached out to him, that they want to negotiate. There's also some reporting that Foreign Minister Arakchi probably reached out to Trump's special envoy, Mr. Witkoff. Do you see a window for diplomacy at the end of this chaos?
Look, part of the complexity of this situation is that, as I said, the military options are not very attractive. The diplomatic options are not very attractive either, because we are in a situation that the Iranian regime, I think, would be reluctant to make major concessions now and provide President Trump with a political win in a situation that he is threatening to bomb Iran once again, and has intervened and interfered in their domestic affairs. And on the US side, although laws of political gravity don't necessarily apply to President Trump, but it is costlier for him now to appear as if he's saving a regime that is on the ropes. If he provides Iran with significant sanctions relief, it appears as a slap in the face of the protesters. So I have a hard time imagining that both sides will be willing and able to soften their red lines, even if the negotiations occur. But of course, a negotiated settlement at the end of the day would be a much more certain and less risky option than pursuing a military confrontation with unpredictable consequences.
Right. Finally, let me just ask you about how people in Iran, especially the protesters, view the sort of foreign pressure that is put on the regime. A lot of people say that the Iranian government actually likes this because it creates a situation where people rally around the flag. There's suddenly a common enemy that all Iranians can unite again. It's not about the regime or the economy. It's about America versus Iran. Is that really how things are playing out in Iran? Or would the protesters perhaps feel, you know what, if there is a foreign intervention, if there are US or Israeli military strikes on the regime power centers, that would actually expedite the fall of this current ruling elite? Which way do the Iranian people actually think?
It's very hard to talk about the general sentiments in Iran because we don't have access to reliable and unbiased surveys inside the country. But one thing is clear, which is that if you look at the reaction in the immediate aftermath of the 12-day war between Iran and Israel and the US, there was a rally around the soil. I don't want to use the word flag because it implies the regime, but I think there was a wave of nationalism that was awakened in the aftermath of that conflict, but it dissipated because at the end of the day, people will have to make ends meet. People would have to be able to feed their children. And this is why you have an explosion of public discontent on the streets. Regardless of that sense of nationalism that is very strong in a historic nation like Iran. But at the end of the day, I think there are differences of views. Some people are so sick and tired with the miserable conditions that they've been under that they would welcome foreign military intervention to get rid of this regime. They are in many ways where some Iraqi opposition were in the run-up to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was to get rid of the regime at any price. But there are some who would like to see support from the international community, but not direct interference. And which of these groups is in the majority in Iran? honestly, it's very, very difficult to say.
Right, because I think you summed it up best at the start of the answer, that there is simply no information, credible information coming out of Iran we can use to actually make such decisions and analysis. But as you're saying, the protest, or this round of unrest at least, seems to be tapering off. The regime somehow, with brutal crackdown and violence, appears to have survived to fight another day. Let's see how the situation evolves over the next couple of days and what the regime does in the aftermath of this crackdown. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Vaez, for speaking to us on First Post.
Thank you for having me.
The world doesn't fit in boxes, so why should your news? From battlefields to negotiation tables, from internet outrage to real-world injustice. The conversations everyone is having and the ones they're avoiding. It's the same show, but this new year, First Post America gets a new look. I'm Kerry Johnston, and this is First Post America.